When Sega left the console market and went into business as a third-party game maker for its former rivals, there were a lot of questions. With Sega's various franchises and studios now being scattered among several platforms, rather than all being at home on one piece of hardware, Sega fans that enjoyed their previous offerings and wanted to follow the company's future work would have to keep a careful eye on where their preferred games ended up. If you were a fan of Sonic Team or Amusement Visions, you would pick the GameCube. If you were a Virtua Fighter, Space Channel 5, or Echo the Dolphin diehard, you'd stick with the PS2. If you liked more experimental things like Toe Jam and Earl 3 and Gun Valkyrie, or arcade follow-ups like The House of the Dead 3 and Crazy Taxi 3, you would have gone with the Xbox. But one thing that appeared to be set for any console owner to get their hands on would be Sega Sports. The 2K series of sports games from Visual Concepts on the Dreamcast had been the defining and most successful franchise on that console. NFL 2K was the top-selling launch title, outshining even Sonic Adventure. NFL 2K1 became an instant bestseller that launched the SegaNet service and brought online gaming to Sega's sports series. Meanwhile, NHL 2K, World Series Baseball 2K1, Virtua Tennis, NBA 2K, and NCAA College Football all brought a full lineup of sports games to a system that was abandoned by the infamous Electronic Arts, that usually supplied at least one iteration of every conceivable sport for a console. When Sega went third-party, it figured that its well-regarded sports games were going to be a surefire asset on the same level that franchises like Sonic and Phantasy Star Online were, especially in North America, where they had been most successful. But it would now have to go head-to-head with Electronic Arts on hardware platforms that they no longer created or controlled. But with the experience that Visual Concepts and Sega's internal Japanese studios had in turning out next-generation sports games to work off of, as well as being the first to take them all online, they had a major head start on their competitors. They had engines they could port and work off of for future iterations, and had some of the only experience in the console space in making these games work online with each other. While early games like Choo Choo Rocket on the Game Boy Advance, Super Monkey Ball on the GameCube's launch, and Acclaim's version of Crazy Taxi signaled some of the first Sega games that come to other platforms, it was their sports games that were part of that initial wave of games to make it to other systems, even before the Dreamcast was put to bed. For the 2K2 season of games, the most popular ones like NFL 2K2 and NBA 2K2 would come to the Xbox and PS2 alongside the Dreamcast, with World Series Baseball 2K2 going from the Dreamcast to the Xbox, and Tennis 2K2 going from Sega's final console over to the PS2. The Dreamcast would keep a few to itself, like the less popular NHL 2K2 and the brand new NCAA College Football 2K2. But the only one of these the GameCube would get would be NBA 2K2, which would actually be the only game to be released in North America on all four next-generation systems. This left Nintendo as the odd man out when it came to Sega's new sports strategy. And while Sega promised that next year's lineup of 2K3 titles would arrive equally on all three platforms, Sega's internal studios had a number of unique projects outside of their mainline sports series that would reward Nintendo fans for their interest in both Sega and the GameCube. This would result in 4 planned exclusive titles for the GameCube, with a significant impetus coming from a brand new partnership Sega would be forming with Nintendo. As mentioned earlier, Sega's NHL and baseball series missed the GameCube. A very good reason for that was that the teams responsible for this were working on other projects for Nintendo's Purple Box instead. While Visual Concepts had been widely hailed for its work on NBA 2K and NFL 2K, it was only one company, and certainly wasn't able to make every sport for Sega. Plus, baseball was one of the few sports with equal interest in both Japan and North America. So when it came time to bring a first-party baseball game to the Dreamcast, it was actually the job of one of Sega's internal studios, WoW Entertainment, to produce World Series Baseball 2K1, which it released in the summer of 2000. Although the game was a graphical smoke show, being the first next-generation baseball title, it was widely panned by critics and players at the time for trying to simplify the gameplay too much, to the point that the player didn't have full control over all of its players in the field, instead giving the computer a lot of handling over fielding automatically, which kind of made the game a glorified pitching and batting simulator rather than a full-blown baseball game. So when the task arose to make a 2K2 game to follow up on this, the job was passed back to Visual Concepts, who was not only able to make a new game in the expected form of a full-blown baseball simulation style, but also to include full online multiplayer, as well as remaining a graphically cutting-edge title. This version was very well received. This is the development split that determined what would come after. For while it may not have appeared that way on the surface, World Series Baseball 2K1 and 2K2 were largely different games from different sides of the world, just sharing a title. These two paths diverged once Sega went third-party and could start publishing games all over the place. At the Tokyo Game Show in 2001, as part of its sizzle reel of titles it was unveiling, Sega of Japan showed a new baseball game called Line Drive Baseball, coming from the Japanese side of the company. This would be a follow-on from the World Series Baseball 2K1 work that they had done on the Dreamcast. Meanwhile, the Americans over at Visual Concepts were also working on pushing forward their work from World Series Baseball 2K2, which they would choose to bring to the Xbox simply as World Series Baseball. Both games actually had full-blown MLB licenses and all the trappings of being a big baseball game from Sega. But the Japanese effort would be retitled to Home Run King, which would be brought exclusively to the GameCube, and was not to be confused with World Series Baseball, which would be the official continuation of the Dreamcast series exclusively for the Xbox. Being a spiritual successor to the much-maligned World Series Baseball 2K1, this change in name and branding to Home Run King much more accurately reflected what Sega's WoW Entertainment was actually trying to go for in the first place. That is, a simplified and easy-to-play arcade style of sports game rather than a full-blown simulation title, which the Americans preferred to make and to play. This game would hone in very specifically on batting, and would leave fielding as an optional aspect. However, once I booted this game up, I was surprised to find that it was more or less a fully built-out baseball sim. Yeah, it does have the advertised home run derby mode, which is a hell of a lot of fun, but it also has a full-on character builder, team management modes, as well as quick pick-up and play game modes, full seasons, playoffs, and exhibitions. Going off the full disclaimer from my earlier sports episodes that I am not a sports gamer, I'm at the very best an extremely casual understander of sports. So I can only give that perspective on a game like this. That said, it was pretty fair and fun for a baseball sim, even for someone like me. The batting is of course a huge focus, and the control over your hitting cursor to try and land the proper angle on hitting the ball, a carryover from the home run mode, is probably its best feature. But unlike the semi-automated fielding of World Series Baseball 2K1, you do have pretty robust control over fielding here too, which is where I fall down usually. I noticed in the settings that this game has a different setting for aiding you in batting, fielding, and pitching. And I thought maybe this was a kind of on-off slider for automating certain gaming functions. But when I maxed out or emptied these gauges, I neither totally gained nor totally relinquished control. Players still found their way towards a fly ball when I had no aid turned on, but even with player aid turned up all the way, the players still don't operate entirely on their own. So I'm guessing, based on the manual also being fairly sparse about the degree of aid, that this is just a slider for the amount of computer assistance your actions are given, not a full-on automation setting. One thing I can definitely comment on, though, is the graphics. For their time, they are fantastic, and the game even supports 480p progressive scan, perhaps a holdover from all of Sega's teams already working on 480p from virtually all of their Dreamcast projects. Of course, being a game going for realism, it doesn't hold up as well in a modern lens. The edging around most models stands out. The so-so character face models as texture maps have been done better in other games of this era, and the audience is constructed almost entirely of two-dimensional flat cutouts. But that's something most games of this vintage still had to do. The environments are by far the highlight of the whole production, and show how nicely modern systems could render realistic worlds. Still, the fact this game was renamed and removed from the World Series Baseball series kind of indicates it was of secondary importance compared to Visual Concepts' continuation of the long-running North American franchise. But perhaps a sign that the Japanese side of Sega had a closer affinity for Nintendo's system than its Western counterparts. As with Home Run King, the other game Sega brought out on March 18, 2002, also draws its earliest origins to the Dreamcast, and partially explains the gap the GameCube had with certain sports. Back in 2000, Sega had contracted Black Box Games to develop its next-generation hockey title for the Dreamcast, NHL 2K. This game was also met with a mixed critical reaction, although not as severe as World Series Baseball 2K1. But enough so that Sega cancelled NHL 2K1 in favor of putting the additional development cycle time into NHL 2K2. Again, Black Box Games would have the job of iterating on their first game, and in fact, by the time it shipped in February of 2002, it will be the last officially released Dreamcast game in North America. But before they were done with Sega and the Dreamcast, Black Box began working on a soccer game for Sega as well, with Sega anticipating getting the FIFA license and adding a proper simulation-style soccer game to its 2K sports lineup. The earliest builds towards this project started out on the Dreamcast, with Black Box taking its hockey engine and changing a few variables to take its character models from skating around a rink to running around a grass pitch. But shortly after this work started, Sega made its decision to pull the plug on the Dreamcast, and they also failed to obtain the FIFA license. So Black Box was instead put to work continuing its efforts to make a soccer game in whichever way they saw fit. Since the license wasn't there for using real teams and players, they instead decided to run in the other direction and go for an arcade-style, larger-than-life game with fictional original characters. This would first be shown in December of 2001 by Sega and Visual Concepts, who was producing the title with Black Box, as a GameCube exclusive game called Sega Soccer Slam. It directly followed on the trend of arcadeifying different sports, like NBA Jam had done for basketball and NHL Blitz had done for hockey. Now Sega was taking its turn to try that with soccer, although they'd find they were also going to end up against Midway's attempt at that same thing when they made Red Card 2003. But Sega's efforts would be pretty different in going for a more cartoonish and absurdist level of fictional soccer than Midway's game was. Even though Sega Soccer Slam was made by Western developers, it carries a significant inspiration from Sega arcade games for creating heightened archetype characters, the kind of which you'd see in games like Winter Heat, Decathlete, Crazy Taxi, and Propeller Arena, which certainly separates it from any of the other soccer games on the market at that time. The game doesn't have too many settings to fiddle with, but like the others, it does come with progressive scan output, as well as a number of different control schemes too. Something handy for such a frantic, quick, action-y game like this, since you'll want to have controls best suited to what your hands expect to do. The impressive degree of effort put in shows up when you take a look at the Team BIOS section, which gives you some flavor text for just about every character and every team in the game. The creators were clearly proud of their creation here, and giving life to such interchangeable characters is usually a corner that gets cut when trying to make things happen on a deadline. When I took a look at the practice section, my heart sank briefly as I saw 16 points it wanted to drive home. I was worried this would be 16 different sections loaded with things to do and learn and memorize. But actually, I was relieved to find it was just one training section that had 16 steps, each of which were very small and easily digestible, pretty much each revolving around a single control mechanic. I whipped through it in no time and felt genuinely ready to give this game a go. And fortunately I was. This is a very pick-up-and-play game that's meant to be fairly easy and intuitive to understand. It leans probably the heaviest into the arcade style of gameplay of any of the games we're going to be talking about in this episode, and eschews the overly complex and realistic mechanics. Of course, what's also unavoidable is that this game's style and character makes it larger than life and goofier than games like NFL Blitz or NHL Hits. It would be more like the characters from those games if they spent the entire game on fire. But rather than just resting on being a solid, fun pick-up-and-play arcade-style game, Sega Soccer Slam also includes a single-player quest mode, akin to the wonderful World Championship mode that debuted in Virtua Tennis. This lets the player grow and upgrade their character, with items from a store using the money that they earned from their matches, and also the various unique challenges they're presented with outside of standard soccer matches. Of all the games I played for this episode, I found Sega Soccer Slam to be the most hidden gem status of the bunch, and something I might genuinely fire up again sometime, despite my lack of sports enthusiasm. Unfortunately for the GameCube fans in 2002, a few months after Sega Soccer Slam shipped on GameCube in July, Sega announced they would be bringing it over to the PS2 and the Xbox as well, robbing the GameCube of one of its exclusives. Of course, besides the Dreamcast, the other basis for so many of Sega's games was its arcade heritage, and here Sega was still a major player. While it left the console market, it was still a commanding arcade game company, but with its competitive pride no longer a factor in what it did next, and its home console position no longer a consideration, they were now open to try something dramatically new, including things that would have seemed like laughable fanboy fantasies just a few years earlier. On February 18, 2002, Nintendo, Namco, and Sega issued a joint press release announcing that the three companies would be partnering to release a brand new arcade platform based on the GameCube hardware. In one fell swoop, Nintendo had brought together the two most prestigious Japanese arcade game makers in agreement that its hardware was superbly simple, powerful, and would make an excellent basis for future arcade games, while also making them easily portable to the GameCube for home gamers. This was usually what Sega or Namco would be doing with their own arcade boards, with Sega turning the Dreamcast into the Naomi board, and Namco turning Sony's PS2 into the System 246 board, to facilitate easy cross-compatible games. Although the arcade industry was in a permanent and perpetual downslide at this time, it still held some cachet in Japan, where all three companies were based and focused first. This joint project between all three companies would fittingly be known as the Triforce board. The interesting thing for Sega was that it didn't really need the Triforce board. It had just released an arcade board of about equal power the year earlier, its Naomi 2 system. True to that name, the Naomi 2 board was simply an iterative power upgrade over the original Naomi board, and thus would be host to some of the next iterations of their major franchises, most famously Virtua Fighter 4. But that was not the only arcade franchise Sega had been carrying around since the early 90s. Another was a soccer title called Virtua Striker. The very first game in this series was one of Sega's first 3D arcade games right alongside Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA, all of which were created by Yu Suzuki's famous studio, AM2. But Virtua Striker didn't capture the same limelight as its other famous franchises. However, that didn't stop them from iterating, as AM2 would go on to make Virtua Striker 2. And just like with Virtua Fighter 3, it would get a port to the Dreamcast from AM2's protege studio, Genki, which was made up of former AM2 members. However, Virtua Striker 2 was not well received in its home version on Dreamcast. Although it was an absolute graphical revelation in its day, it was first and foremost a pick-up-and-play arcade game, not an in-depth realistic soccer simulation, so reviews panned the game for, stop me if you've heard this earlier, handing too much of the player control over the teams to the computer rather than the player. While this made Virtua Striker 2 a top 10 game in Japanese arcades, it left console gamers desperately wanting for a real soccer game. But thanks to the tragically short life of the console, Dreamcast fans wouldn't get a chance to see any such follow-up. Instead, Virtua Striker 3 would be initially announced as one of the debut titles for the new Naomi 2 board, and in the wake of Sega's leaving the console business, it would turn up at E3 2001 as one of the very first spate of titles that they would bring to the GameCube. As we learned when discussing the development of Super Monkey Ball, the newly created Amusement Visions team had taken over many of AM2's franchises as that studio became more and more deeply involved in the development of the Shenmue series. So it was with Virtua Striker that this new iteration was now in the hands of Amusement Visions, and its head, Toshihiro Nagoshi, gave a very honest quote to Famitsu magazine about his choice of what platform to back. Because hardware performance has evolved to the point where the same things can be developed on any platform, so when talking about platforms these days, it's pointless to talk about performance. So our decision-making process was simple. What hardware provider don't we hate? For that reason, I settled on Nintendo. Although the game was announced at E3 2001, a later interview with Satoshi Mifune at E3 2002 revealed that the pre-rendered mock-up trailer shown at the previous year's show was actually developed by a different team than Amusement Visions, and real work on the game didn't actually start until around that same time. He also shared that the team had gone the extra mile or two for the GameCube version of the game, as they wanted to make it more focused on a single-player experience, adding in their Road to the International Cup mode that would make up that game's own sort of long-term progression and gave the team additional opportunity to spruce up character models and render out every stadium for each team in the game. Among its appearances before release, it was also shown to include a very fun Easter egg, as there was a Sonic team included in the game that consisted of Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, Eggman, and a lineup of Chows, with Yuji Naka listed as the team's manager. Although the game was released to arcades as a Naomi 2 game in 2002 as Virtua Striker 3, its GameCube version would be brought over as Virtua Striker 2002. And at E3 2002, with the announcement of the Triforce board, Amusement Visions also confirmed that it would be bringing the game back over from the GameCube to the Triforce board, returning the game to arcades as Virtua Striker 3 version 2002. An interesting roundabout journey from arcade to home console and back again. All that said, when I booted up Virtua Striker 2002, it was immediately evident, first, that the game had lost none of its luster as a graphically standout title. I know this gets said a fair amount in this series, but graphics were really getting pushed at the time, and at this point, the GameCube was particularly strong at allowing developers to quickly tap its potential horsepower. So combined with a title that was always a graphical showcase, it's no surprise that Virtua Striker 2002 is absolutely gorgeous, and it includes native 480p progressive scan and widescreen support to boot. The control scheme is surprisingly simple and understandable for a game that's pretty closely focused on being more of a simulation than a pick-up-and-play style of game. It's certainly the other side of the coin compared to Sega Soccer Slam, as it features all the real-world teams of the day, player creation tools that even go so far as to let you customize your team's managers, plus a really hardcore Japanese-style team management mode that was just starting to become commercially viable and popular in this era. Of course, this is all quite a bit over my head. But for all of its trappings of simulation and realism, when I got into the game, it was still surprisingly accessible, simple, and easy to play. It's of course not as goofy, extreme, and over-the-top as Soccer Slam was, but it's still a fast-paced, tight, beautiful, and enjoyable game of soccer, even for someone who doesn't usually partake. Soccer Slam would probably still be my game of choice for breaking out for a multiplayer session, since Virtua Striker 2002 did not add in 4-player mode, sticking with the original arcade 2-player mode only. But for a single-player experience, it'd be a decently hard call. Although the single-player quest mode in Soccer Slam would probably put it over the top for me personally. But for someone into the realistic simulation style, the team management mode here would probably be an equally important draw in Virtua Striker's favor. But I leave those kinds of determinations in the hands of sports gamers. I'm more so here to tell the story of how these games came to be and putting them in the context of their times, rather than really ranking or rating whether or not you should play them. And so there was one more major exclusive sports title Sega would bring out for the GameCube to cap off the summer of 2002. This one would combine some of the aspects of all of the others. It was more on the arcade side of its gameplay, like Home Run King. It was an absolute graphics showcase title, like Virtua Striker, and brought a certain artistic flair and style to the table, like Soccer Slam. This was one of the very few titles that AM2 would develop for the GameCube themselves, and was a direct translation of one of its crowning Naomi 2 arcade games, as well as a bit of an unintentional trendsetter. This was Beach Spikers. I've mentioned Virtua Tennis in a few of the earlier titles, since it was one of the most surprising success stories of Sega's sports franchises in this era. And Beach Spikers is probably the closest spiritual successor to Virtua Tennis that was made, even though Virtua Tennis was a product of Hitmaker, or Sega AM3, and Beach Spikers was created by AM2. But it's also just due to the similarity in the sports involved. But the similarities do go further than that. The presentation opening the game, the interesting English dubbing on the title screen, and the menu interfaces all bear strong similarities as well. The game is another graphical marvel that's meant to make the viewer question if they are viewing a video game or a television broadcast, something Virtua Tennis was well known for in its day as well. Being an arcade game, there's not too many settings to configure, the game supports 480p progressive scan at boot, and other than that, not much else to change. Much like the very welcoming and constructive training mode from Soccer Slam, Beach Spikers also takes you step by step, building on each part to get you into the game in a pretty short order, and again left me feeling actually pretty confident I could play this game somewhat competently. Something that has grown a bit from Virtua Tennis is the relationship the player will have with their partner CPU character, as the game gives you an actual teamwork meter, as well as the choice of prompts on how to respond to your teammates when you win or lose. This makes a single-player mode of the game almost as much a partner relationship simulator as a volleyball game, since growing your teammate becomes a kind of a game within the game itself. But Beach Spikers isn't done just with its single-player mode. It also has surprisingly interesting and robust multiplayer modes too. Here it's almost borrowing a page from Super Monkey Ball in terms of taking the premise of volleyball to come up with unique and fantastical multiplayer challenges, like a hot potato bomb version of volleyball, a race to capture the flag from across the beach, a spiking equivalent to a home run derby, seeing how many spikes you can get in on your opponent, and of course, a regular multiplayer volleyball match. Being a Naomi 2 game, this game's graphics were a cut above many other titles in 2002, with beautiful, realistic environments endowed with all kinds of real-world advertising, plus a cameo from the Big Blue Hedgehog. It's also noticeable that its character models are models in both senses of the word, since Beach Spikers went with an all-female roster of players and, based on the sport being played, featured those women in swimwear. There's little denying this was a pretty intentional aspect of the game's sexual appeal for certain audiences, and there's an oddly noticeable way in which the players embrace each other at the end of matches. But Beach Spikers would look like a chased canary in this particular coal mine when just a few months later an Xbox exclusive from the infamously skimpier Dead or Alive fighting game series would one-up AM2 with their own volleyball game, Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball, which utilized something that their fighting games were famous for, their breast rendering and movement physics, taking the concept of sexually suggestive female characters to a whole new level. But that's a story for the Xbox. Now, the sales figures involved here are somewhat incomplete from VG charts, as some regions like Japan are not included in all of them. But even the incomplete data tells us the story we're starting to get familiar with for the GameCube. Home Run King was a North American exclusive release, published directly by Sega of America, despite being developed in Japan. It reportedly sold through 110,000 units on GameCube, but the aforementioned World Series Baseball over on the Xbox sold through 230,000 units worldwide between its release in North America and Europe. While the somewhat maligned Virtua Striker 2 on the ill-fated Dreamcast rang up 370,000 units in sales between North America and Japan, those same two territories only recorded 50,000 units sold for Virtua Striker 2002 on the GameCube, a pretty huge drop-off from a system that was already notorious for its poor software sales. For Sega Soccer Slam, VG Charts does not have any recorded Japanese sales for the GameCube version, so its 70,000 recorded units, compared to the Xbox's 50,000 units, and the PS2's 120,000 units, are questionable on comparison, but roughly does follow some of the same trends we've seen with other games, with the PS2 version vastly outselling the GameCube one, and the GameCube coming usually in third behind the Xbox. Beach Spikers is again recorded without its Japanese sales, so just between North America and Europe, it registers 100,000 units in sales. The closest competitor I think makes sense to compare it to is the aforementioned Dead or Alive beach volleyball game, which, according to the same source, has that game selling 590,000 units worldwide, with 140,000 of those being in Japan, where the Xbox was practically a non-factor in the console market. If the Xbox version of a game can outsell your Western sales in Japan, you certainly have a problem, even without knowing the game's Japanese sales. So while Sega studios were attempting to show their loyalty for Nintendo with a spate of exclusive sports games in order to make up for skipping many of its Western-developed 2K games, they certainly weren't being rewarded for their efforts. Sega was starting to get a message. Games like Sonic and Monkey Ball did well on GameCube. Sports games, not so much. We'll have to see how Sega processes this information and how they treat the GameCube with their future releases.